So I'm glad you're here because
My
I
pleasure.
do want to talk about this. But before we do, I really do want to give you the opportunity to explain what the American fuel and petrochemical manufacturers do.
Absolutely. So we're a trade association. We've been around since 1902. We started with the independent oil refiners that were not part of the Standard Oil. So it was before Standard Oil was broken up.
So there were two or three.
They're a handful. Hardy competitors. That's kind of our heritage. And we've, like I said, been in existence for that long, and now we represent over 95% of the oil refiners in the United States. So people that you've heard of, people that you haven't, small, big, everybody in between.
Let's talk about this Green New Deal because my sense is that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would like to run everybody out of business.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when they run you out of business, they want to guarantee you a government job.
That's right. I don't want that deal.
Let's break this down. It seems like even, what's his name? Andrew Yang was on stage the other night, and I was kind of surprised he made the statement that we're only 15% at most of emissions in the world, and if we went to zero, the rest of the world still has a problem. So, and then he made the statement about, so we all need to move to higher ground.
Yeah. He got a lot of pushback on Twitter
did.
after that from the more liberal members of the party, actually. But yeah, it's global greenhouse gases. It's a global issue. It's not just the United States. I think the numbers that I've seen is if the U.S. emissions went to zero, that would impact climate like 0.2 of a degree or something like that. So when you look at U.S. total carbon emissions are actually less than what China has increased in the last 17 years. Just the Chinese increase. So it's increasingly a global issue, not just a U.S. issue.
And directly more related to where you are in your space is the war, in addition to that with the Green New Deal, is basically the abolition of the automobile if it's run by gasoline.
Yeah, well, one of the provisions of the Green New Deal, and it's hard, it's kind of like nailing Jell-O to the wall a little bit because it's very aspirational, right? And they don't really have a lot of details. But one of the things they say that they want to do is within 10 years have zero fossil fuel, which is impossible. It's just impossible. There's just no way it could happen, right? So one of the ways they think that they need to do that is to go to a so-called zero-emitting vehicle, an electric vehicle. But what we did, we actually looked in Colorado, which is right now, unfortunately, they've got a new governor who really wants to follow in the footsteps of California. Can't recommend that. It's clearly a different direction than Georgia and some of the other states we've heard about here, but Colorado seems to be wanting to go that direction. We looked at this. We looked at comparing a new internal combustion engine vehicle and an EV, and actually they're right on parity with greenhouse gas emissions because guess what? Where does electricity come from? Yeah. I hear a lot of good answers. This is a smart crowd because actually pollsters ask this question routinely. 20 to 25% of the people say the wall. Electricity comes from the wall. Yeah, so, which I guess in a way is the right answer, but in Colorado, they've got close to 20% are renewable fuels for their electricity grid, but they rely on coal and natural gas and so forth. So when you take a life cycle of that, because it's expensive and greenhouse gas intensive to mine these things that they've got to put into the batteries, they start out with a deficit, and then they're getting fueled up from electricity that's generated from fossil fuels.
It's funny. I think we may have had this conversation before. That remember when I was in, I guess, 11th grade, I wrote a paper on this issue. Said the problem. This was when they were doing solar-powered cars and green cars and stuff were just coming out. And said, well, the problem is that you don't have enough of a power grid. If everybody switched to an electric vehicle tomorrow, we'd have to build more coal-burning power plants to be able to do it. And the teacher, of course, would just refuse to believe it. But I'd read the article, and yeah, I mean, it's true. These electric cars, they don't run on unicorn farts. They actually have to get the power from somewhere.
They do. And, if people want to buy an electric vehicle, God bless them. It's a free country. They should feel free to do that. But what we have a problem with is these subsidies upon subsidies. There's 5 different ways that EVs are subsidized, for example. You could go through the litany of government programs, but it totals over $20,000 of subsidies. And we talked to one automobile CEO. He said, yeah, we lose about $14,000 for every EV we sell. So.
Wow.
Even with all the subsidies, they're still not able to make them at a profit at today's technology. Now, maybe down the road, they'll come up with the kind of technology that's competitive, but that gets right back to what we've been talking about today and what Senator Scott talked about, which is a free market. We need to have confidence in a free market to develop solutions that work for people. And unfortunately, all of that just is skipping right over the heads. And the left keeps ratcheting up, and Democratic politicians, even some like Joe Biden is now the moderate, and Nancy Pelosi is a moderate. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I don't know if you knew, but Barack Obama's a conservative.
That's right. Barack Obama's a conservative now. Even they are saying, well, we got to be carbon neutral by 2030 or 2040 or whatever. It's just totally unrealistic. And they're getting, hammered from the left.
Well, in that regard, let me read you this quote. This is from the Chief of Staff to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Quote, "The interesting thing about the Green New Deal," and I'm sorry, I can't do a Russian accent. I'm not very good at it. But the interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. We really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing. Yeah. How do you square that with all the rallying cries on the left?
Well, I appreciate the honesty.
Yeah.
I think you would look at the Green New Deal. They certainly have this green patina on it. But if you dig a little deeper, you find some things out about what the real motivation is. If you really wanted to attack this because of climate change or whatnot, you would be all supportive of nuclear power, for example. But right? Yeah. And we're all of the above. Sure, we want all kinds of different power sources, right? Whatever can deliver the best electricity, the best price. But instead, in her fact document, she talks about not just not allowing new nuclear plants, which you'd have to do to replace coal and natural gas, right? Mm-hmm. But she talks about decommissioning existing plants. So this is clearly not a GHG thing primarily in a lot of ways. It's about, again, changing the entire economy. And unfortunately, they want to start with things like the automobile. They want to start with our power sector and so forth. So it's really multifaceted, and it's got to be fought at every level.
I want to spend a little more time on the automobile because I realize I sound crazy when I say this, and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but I really do think that one of the things the left has done between CAFE standards and everything else is to force people to shrink the size of the car, which also disincentivizes people having a large family. Yeah. I go to church with people who have 5 kids, and it's very expensive for them to be able to buy a car now. Yeah. You've got Prince Harry and whatnot saying that they're only going to have 2 kids because of climate change. And there seems to be this ongoing war with the left trying to get the fossil fuel burning automobile to be able to get 200 miles to the gallon, which means it's going to be made out of plastic and fall apart.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, there's a lot there, and I agree with you. I've got 4 kids myself, and this was really brought to home to me. I've unfortunately lived in the Beltway for some time. Now I'm 20 miles outside the Beltway.
Good for you.
And try to commute in every day.
You feel your soul coming back?
Yes, go to Real America and then commute in to battle. But I was living in Arlington County, which is a close-in county, and we had 2 kids at the time. 2 small kids. One of them's here with me today. He's not so small anymore. But at the time, we had 2 kids. A speaker came into our local community. We were talking about trying to engage at all levels of the community earlier today, too. He came, and he was trying to tell everybody to get rid of their car. And my wife showed up, and she just raised her hand and said, "How am I supposed to get groceries?" He said, "Oh, well, you can get a bike, you can get a Burley, you can the 2 kids in there, and then you can get another trailer maybe on top of that, and you can put back." And she's just like, "What world is this person living in?" Right? I think there's a move afoot, certainly an interest in kind of pushing towards mass transit and bicycles and scooters. And again, bicycles and scooters are great, but there's a lot of things that they can't do, like delivering groceries when you got small kids. Like, for example, look at the highway bill this year. Republicans, right before they got out of town, and Democrats passed out of the EPW committee $277 billion or so in highway spending. And we do need to spend money on bridges and roads and making sure they're repaired. But for the first time, they put in a climate section. Under a Republican chairman, they're spending $10 billion on climate change in the highway bill. One of those programs is $1 billion in order to fund EV charging stations. So and ironically, electric vehicles, you know how much they contribute to the Highway Trust Fund?
0.
You're all paying for it through the gas tax. That's going to fund the Highway Trust Fund, and they're turning around and spending it to put in chargers. Ironically enough, Vice President Pence talked about his dad being in the gas station business. I can guarantee he did not get a federal loan to start his gas station. There was a demand, and he met it. It was a way for him to serve his neighbor, to find out what his neighbor needed. He started a service station, serving his neighbors. This idea that we need government command and control to totally transform the economy is a scary one.
Well, let's talk about command and control versus free market, particularly with what you do in the sector that you represent and work with in Washington, D.C. We've got fuel and petrochemical manufacturers and refiners around the country who for years now, even under some Republican administrations, saw continuous increases in regulation, blame for things that weren't their responsibility. and now suddenly the president is rolling back a lot of these regulations. But I mean, how does that impact just the consumer at the gas pump?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways it does. I think the president talks about energy dominance. And, thank God for that. And that was American ingenuity, especially on the upstream, we call it in the oil and gas business. So the folks getting the oil out of the ground, it's been a total revolution in Texas, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the fracking revolution. We are now the #1 producer of oil and gas in the entire world. Yeah. Yeah. And that is changing geopolitics. It's changing politics in Europe, where we can supply gas in particular, natural gas, to our allies there. They don't have to be dependent on Russia. We're seeing it at the pump. We've had good, solid, low prices for gasoline and for oil for a long time now because of this production revolution. And so I think that's been critical. Now, a big piece of that was the fracking revolution really happened very quickly. It spread very quickly, and it was just very productive in a lot of communities, and the left really couldn't organize to stop it. And so, thank God for the free market and that production boom, which is helping, millions of people provide for their family. Our industry, we're the downstream sector, so we take the oil and we make the products that we use every day. We got 3 million people working in and around our industry, good paying jobs. You don't necessarily have to have a college degree. You've got to work hard and be safety conscious, and you can have a job. And so, it's really changed the world.
It's interesting you mentioned fracking, how the left, you're right, really didn't have a game plan to stop it, and so they've had to resort to fear tactics that causes earthquakes, it causes water pollution, it causes your water to burn, and they're also now dealing with the war on pipelines. They would rather these products be transported by trains that tip over as opposed to a pipeline.
It's a head scratcher. So for a couple years ago, I worked at the Heritage Foundation. Glad to see Heritage Action here. It's a great organization.
Amen.
And one of the things Heritage uncovered was there was a movie, I think it was called Gasland. It was such a bust that I don't even remember if that's the right one or if it was a different one. But they uncovered, the Heritage Foundation did, that and it was one of these documentaries where they're trying to scare people about fracking and all that.
This is the one where people were lighting their water faucet and the fire would come out and stuff, and completely misrepresented what was
completely
happening.
Misrepresented it, and they found out one of the funding agencies for that was the Sovereign Wealth Fund for the United Arab Emirates. They may not like to have a natural gas production increase in the United States. So that was kind of a fun one to see, but it happened so quickly and revolutionized everything here that it's really changed the conversation. That's a good thing. That means that we're able to get to work. We're able to heat our homes. We're able to do all of these things outside of government regulation.
I remember back when you were at Heritage, having conversation with you about Anwar, and Republicans, or the Democratic opposition at the time was, well, it's going to take 10 years to do anything up there, so there's no reason to do it. We need to do things. And then gas prices keep going up. They say, well, it's going to take 10 years, so there's no reason. It doesn't deal with it. And now suddenly the president is open to that. And I mean, just for perspective, for where we're drilling up there, if you can imagine a first-class postage stamp on a football field, that postage stamp represents the footprint of where we would be disrupting Anwar compared to the overall. And yet still they're horrified by the idea of tapping into these resources.
That's right. Well, it's a very lucrative fundraising device at times, and it was actually, the ban was taken away a couple years ago. So in 7 or 8 years, maybe we'll see some of that oil from up there. But you're exactly right. It takes long-term planning in these things. And that's the thing. So these investments are decades long. And so we talk about this all the time in our industry. One of the problems we have is another climate change program of the federal government called the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard. And before you snooze and fall asleep, it's a really troublesome. For a lot of our companies, it's their #1 expenditure behind crude oil. They pay more to comply with an EPA program than they'd pay their own employees. And the idea was to try to get ethanol in the fuel supply in a time when we thought that there was a shortage and so forth. But it's exactly the same thing you see. You see government making projections that don't come out to be true. And that is what the left is kind of trying to do now, is they're making these grand pronouncements that in 30 years, everything is going to be different, or in some cases, in 10 years, we're going to be off of fossil fuels. And it never works out that way. I don't know why we can't just trust the free market to deliver value to consumers. And when the technology is there, there's going to be a revolution. But until then, we're just wasting all of our money. And in fact, we're wasting it on the wealthy. So for EVs, for example, Eric, I think you know this, but we looked at the EV tax credit. $7,500 of your tax money going to pay for an electric vehicle. About 80% of that goes to people making $100,000 or more a year, almost twice the national median average. And you know what else? Half of EVs sold are sold in one state, California. So you have people in Georgia and Texas and everywhere else in the country giving their hard-earned tax dollars so that very wealthy people in California can drive their Tesla.
Well, we had the situation here in Georgia where I think there was a $7,000 or $8,000 tax credit in Georgia, and they finally got rid of it. And it's amazing what it did to the sale of electric vehicles, which tells me that there isn't a market for them if you got to have a government subsidy.
That's right. Well, if you look, the technology just isn't there for electric vehicles right now. And like I said, some people like them, for whatever reason, that's fine. Knock yourself out. But putting the thumb on the scale is completely the wrong approach. So the places where it's actually gotten a little bit more traction are Norway and China. Norway, because they tax the internal combustion engine cars out the roof. So a Ford Mustang there is over $100,000.
Wow.
Just to give you an idea, okay? And you get the VAT tax that the EVs were exempted from. They're allowed to drive in carpool lanes and all the rest. That's how they've been able to do that. In China, it's even worse. They know how to do central planning in China. If they want you to do something, they're going to find a way to do it. So you can't register your internal combustion engine vehicle there unless you win a lottery. But you can go to the front of the queue if you buy an EV. So it's these kinds of extreme, heavy-handed measures that have been necessary to push the technology. So it might be a clue that it's just not there quite yet. And
I await the Tom Friedman column on how we need to do a lottery like China for the internal combustion engine. You mentioned ethanol. I'm not a fan. In every 4 years, we have presidential candidates who run and say we're going to end this subsidy, and then they go to Iowa and they cave. And it's a continuing disappointment to me. I mean, if you would, I don't even really have a question here other than I hate ethanol and would like for you to talk about ethanol.
It's good.
It's just, I mean, we know what it does to engines. We know what it also does to the cost of fuel. We realize that we're just giving subsidies to farmers and they're growing crops for gas as opposed to food.
Well, it's interesting. This last time around, there was a courageous politician, I think you know who I'm talking about, who went to Iowa and he said, I don't think the RFS is working and is a good idea. Senator Ted Cruz. I mean, talk about bravery, right? And do you remember what happened in the Iowa caucus? He won the Iowa caucus. So I think he showed that you don't necessarily have to be in lockstep with that particular way to help farmers. And in fact, to some degree, people should certainly be free to buy fuel that doesn't have ethanol. It's just really hard to find it now. It's almost E10 everywhere. And that's because of the renewable fuel standard. Back when Congress put it into place in 2005 and 2007, they kept projecting that gasoline was going to go up and up and up and up. I know this shocks you. Government projections aren't always accurate. So in part because our cars are so much more fuel efficient, the gasoline demand has basically stayed the same. And so they had these numbers of ethanol that had to be hit that kept going up and up and up. And it caused the compliance cost for the RFS to go through the roof. And so we've been asking the president, especially the last couple of months, to protect small refineries. There was a provision in the law that said small refineries could get an exemption from the RFS. And we've been telling the president, we know that you made some promises in Iowa, but you also promised to help manufacturing jobs in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin, where there are refineries. We said, Mr. President, you need to keep this up. And we're hopeful that he'll listen, just so that people can have the freedom to fuel what they want. In fact, these small refinery exemptions, they've been helping protect those jobs, and they haven't really impacted how much ethanol is in the fuel supply. So we're hopeful that it'll make the right call.
We've been trying to do throughout the conference today and tomorrow some activist workshops and trying to make people more able to reach out and explain things. I know people care about these issues, and in particular, I know from just my radio show, the number of people who call in all the time and complain about the subsidies of electric cars, and it's an unfair advantage, and you're subsidizing rich people in California. I mean, what do people need to know when they approach Congress on this issue as to where to go and what to say on this?
Step one is to be educated. So I mentioned that highway bill, so it was put out in the evening, the night before it was marked up. So it was out for 10 to 12 hours. And then it was voted on by voice vote. There were no amendments, no real discussion. So you've got to know what's going on, and then you've got to engage on it. And so in this particular provision, again, it's $1 billion to spend on EV charging stations. Again, they're primarily going to benefit one state. So once you know, you can be armed with the knowledge. And I thought Lester earlier did an excellent job reminding us how to be effective in talking to our legislators. So I would go back and review your notes from that section and arm yourself with accurate information and make sure that you're up to speed, listening to Eric's show and plugging in with the Heritage Foundation and Americans for Prosperity and these other groups that are kind of keeping an eye on the shenanigans that are going on in Washington.
Let me talk about refiners for a minute. I've mentioned to you before, I grew up in Louisiana. The Exxon refinery in Baton Rouge is massive. And it seems like, going full circle to the Green New Deal, there is this ongoing assault, not just directly on refiners and manufacturers, but also going to the ancillary businesses, the pipe manufacturers and others, and targeting them to drive up their costs to make it more expensive. What do you as an industry do to try to push back on these sorts of approaches as the left becomes more militarized against the means of production of your business?
They do, and this is a great question for Chip Roy tomorrow. He's in the oil and gas industry, and he'll tell you that there can be a lot of pushback. Thankfully, places like Texas and Louisiana, New Mexico, they kind of understand the business. They've seen it firsthand. And again, it's about being educated. So one of the things that we do as a trade association in Washington, we try to figure out what do policymakers think of our industry and all that. And we did some polling, and we found out that among policymakers, they think that we're unsafe, which is puzzling to us because if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, refining and petrochemical are the second and the third safest industries in America. So we said there's a major disconnect here. So we've gone office to office to make sure that they understand how safe our operations are and how much we contribute to the local economy. And that's an important part. And then also just making sure that constituents, those who rely on the products each and every day, are vocal about it, that they understand that it's getting you to work, it's helping you in almost everything you have. So your smartphone is going to have a petrochemical product in it. The seal that helps to keep it watertight, that's a petrochemical product. Fibers that, other than cotton, probably your clothes are going to be petrochemicals. It's in everything that we know for modern day life, which makes you kind of smile when they talk about there being no fossil fuels in 10 years. They don't know that 2/3 of a windmill comes from plastic and from oil and gas. Solar panels, same thing. There's a lack of education on the other side that's pretty woeful.
Well, my cousins here lives in part of Texas where I know they've had power grid issues in parts of Texas where they've gotten so dependent on non-fossil fuels, and believe it or not, there are times that the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, and makes it very difficult to be able to power people's lives.
It certainly does, and that's one of the things that my friends in the power sector talk about constantly. Is 24-hour power. Chairman Barrasso from EPW, he's really good on this. And natural gas is actually one of the ways that you try to increase wind, but if you do that, you need to have capacity in case the wind isn't blowing. And you need to work on technology. Again, it's maybe a little bit forcing ahead of its time. You got to have a way to store the energy so that when the wind's not blowing, you can use it later on. It's got some challenges for sure. And using other tools of the government to stamp out reliable fuel and affordable fuel. Coal and natural gas is affordable fuel at a time when energy, and this is a regressive tax essentially, Eric. People that have lower income, a higher portion of their income is spent heating their homes and so forth. Well, maybe not Al Gore, because he's got a private jet and all that. He's got to worry about. I had to smile this week when 114 private jets flew into Italy to talk about, for their owners to talk about global warming. The irony there, right? They really should have been taking sailboats, from wherever they were. I guess they would have had to wait, they would have to plan it out a couple months in advance. But in any event, it's just the hypocrisy is really rank.
Well, it is interesting to see. You've got, was it Daryl Hannah, the actress who has a windmill on her property to generate power, that practicing what she believes. But it's just ironic to me how rarely it seems the progressives right now are willing to practice what they believe when it comes to the environment. They want to tell us we've got 10 years left, and they certainly aren't acting like it.
Yeah, I think there was a controversy for AOC too when it was revealed that she was using Uber and taxis, and not mass transit, and
eating a hamburger. Beef is bad these days, yeah.
That's right. Well, I think increasingly people are understanding. I'm hopeful that the Green New Deal will really unite folks to understand just how crazy the ultimate view is from some of these folks. And the scary thing is that it's going into the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that's a really scary thing. You've got a handful. So Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado, and I'm sure I just heard any chance that he had to get above an asterisk in the polls. But he tried to be somewhat reasonable in Colorado and even-handed, and then he had a new Democrat come in that took this drastic left turn to California, and that seems to be where the energy is in the Democratic Party. And for the good of the nation, I hope that doesn't continue.
Well, the couple minutes we've got left, I really want to focus on the activist side of this. What should people who care about this issue know? What's the thing that they need to be paying attention to right now, policy-wise?
I'd say three things. I'd give you three things. So right now the administration is rewriting the CAFE rules, which are the fuel economy rules you were just talking about. And the reason why you should care about that is because it's causing the price of new cars to increase. The Heritage Foundation came out with a study that the CAFE program increases the cost of a new car by up to $7,000. This is not nothing. This is significant. And what it's doing is, again, the government projected 10 years ago that the auto fleet was going to be about 60% cars and 40% trucks. So who wants to guess what the percentage of trucks and SUVs is right now? Just say out a number. 70, 80, that's right. 70 to 80% is cars or SUVs and trucks. That's what people want to drive. They want to have the utility. They want to have the power. They want to pull a boat. They want to have room for the kids, I've got a minivan myself. So the government
It's brave of you to admit on stage.
Well, I don't have a minivan. My wife does. I do have to drive it occasionally. But the reason why this rule is important, two reasons. So you have the fuel economy themselves. The auto manufacturers haven't been able to meet these standards for 3 years. And the liberals are saying you got to keep ratcheting it up and up and up. And what happens is it becomes a transfer. Companies like Tesla, they get extra credits and then turn around and have to sell it to the other auto manufacturers. So how do they recoup those costs? They're going to increase the cost of a Dodge Ram or a Ford F-150 or an Expedition or whatever. That's going to cost more so they can turn around and buy credits from Tesla. And so the president has taken that on, and he's also said that California doesn't have any right to set the national standard for the rest of us.
Amen.
And, just a tiny bit of history. You probably remember back in the early days of the Obama administration, he got the big three in, and he got California in, and they set these standards to begin with. And two of those three big companies were in bankruptcy and basically owned by the federal government at the time. So they came up with this deal. It was never going to be achievable. The one thing they got was what was called a midterm evaluation. So they said, halfway through this, we're going to look at this and see if it's realistic. So guess what happens in fall of 2016? They're supposed to look at it in April 2017. The Obama administration sped up that review before Donald Trump could take office. Said, oh, everything's fine. Oh, yeah, we can report 6 months ahead of deadline. Everything's good. The standards are great. They rushed it through without comment. So when the president came in, the first thing he did, he said, no, we're going to reopen this and we're really going to evaluate it. And they've looked at it and they've determined that they need time for the auto manufacturers to catch up. And like I said, the most important thing is he's going to say to California, you don't get the right to tell us the rest of the country what we're going to drive. And so keep your eye on that. Keep focused on that. I'll give you two other quick ones. I know I took a lot of time on that one. Sorry. The other two are the highway bill, I think, is going to be an important one. I want to keep an eye on it to see if they're going to start. This is a brand new program, this $1 billion. And one thing we've seen with the highway bill is the more that gets diverted away from fixing potholes and fixing bridges, that part of it just keeps growing. They're spending more and more on bicycle paths, and I love bicycle paths. That's great. If a local community wants to do that, it's fine. Will we need federal government money to do that when we've got bridges in disrepair? No. But that keeps growing. And so if this thing gets introduced under a Republican-controlled Senate and signed by a Republican president, you can only imagine what's going to happen in a few years. It's just going to grow and grow and grow. So I'd keep an eye on that one as well. And then lastly, I would say the EV tax credit. So Eric, you've been frustrated by the way Washington works. It's like at the end of the session, right before they head off for a vacation or homework period, things get jammed in. And they're looking at tax extenders. These are like 15 provisions that get extended year after year. It's like the lobbyist's best friend, right? Everybody working on these year-round to try to get their tax provision done. They're talking about throwing in there an extension of that $7,500 tax credit for EVs. So we're looking at that right and saying that's bad policy. Half goes to one state, 80% goes to the rich. So you can keep an eye on those three things, I would say, would be the three biggest ones in transportation to keep an eye on right now.
That's useful. Thank you very much for your time.
No, my pleasure.
I appreciate
Thanks for having me.
Derrick Morgan, thank you.